On the 27th of July, 1656, in the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, a 23-year-old man was issued the most severe writ of excommunication in the recorded history of that congregation. The document, the sherem, was read aloud in the synagogue. It condemned him in language that the rabbis reserved for the gravest transgressions. It forbade any member of the community from speaking to him, doing business with him, reading anything he had written, coming within 4 cubits of his physical presence. It commanded that no one assist him in any way, and that everyone avoid him as if he were contagious. He was 23 years old. He had grown up in this community. His father had been a respected merchant and a pillar of the congregation. He had studied Torah and Talmud and philosophy in the community school. These were, until that afternoon, his people. The exact reasons for the excommunication are not recorded in the document. The document only says that the rabbis knew of abominable heresies and monstrous acts, without specifying what the heresies were or what the acts consisted of. What we know is this: he never appealed it, he never recanted, he never attempted reconciliation. He walked out of the community of his birth, the community that had formed him, that spoke his language, that held the graves of his family, and he did not look back. He moved to a small room. He learned to grind lenses, the fine, patient, physically demanding work of shaping glass for telescopes and microscopes to support himself. He began writing, and over the next 20 years, working alone, in poverty, in the specific, chosen, entirely voluntary obscurity of a man who had decided that the truth was more important than the approval of any community that required him to stop thinking. His name was Baruch Spinoza, and what he discovered in the lens-grinding workshop, in the small rented rooms, in the long, patient, extraordinarily rigorous work of thinking more clearly than almost anyone before him about what a human being actually is and what freedom actually means, is what most of us are still trying to learn. There is a specific kind of suffering that most people in midlife carry quietly, without a name for it. Not the suffering of loss, though that is often present. Not the suffering of failure, though that may be there too. The suffering of resistance. The particular, persistent, profoundly exhausting anguish of a person who knows rationally that certain things cannot be changed, and who is still, at some deeper level, furious that they cannot be changed. The health diagnosis that arrived and rearranged everything. The marriage that ended. The career that went in the direction it went rather than the direction you intended. The aging parent, the adult child making choices you cannot influence, the organization that is what it is, that will not become what you need it to be, that you have spent years trying to fix or change or improve or survive, and that tomorrow morning will be exactly what it was this morning. We know in the abstract that we cannot control what we cannot control. We have read the Stoics, we have heard about acceptance, we have nodded at the Serenity Prayer. And then we wake at 3 in the morning, and the thing that cannot be changed is still there, and the resistance to it is still there, and the knowing that we should accept it and the not accepting it are both present simultaneously, and knowing what we should do has not, so far, produced the doing of it. Spinoza spent his life building a philosophy addressed exactly to this gap. Not the gap between knowing and doing in the moral sense, not the question of why we act badly when we know better. The gap between understanding freedom intellectually and experiencing it actually. Between knowing that resistance to the unchangeable is irrational and finding in the body, in the chest at 3 in the morning, that the knowledge has not yet become freedom. His answer to this gap, arrived at through 20 years of solitary thinking in rented rooms, expressed in the most rigorously geometric philosophical prose ever written, was not a technique, not a practice in the ordinary sense. It was a transformation of understanding so complete that the emotions themselves, not the behavior of a person suppressing emotions, but the actual felt quality of the emotions, change. Because what we feel, Spinoza said, is not separate from what we understand. It is made of understanding. And when the understanding goes deep enough, when we see clearly enough what is actually happening and why, the suffering that came from seeing it unclearly begins, on its own, to dissolve. Baruch Spinoza was born in 1632 in Amsterdam, the son of Portuguese Jewish merchants whose families had fled the Inquisition. The Sephardic Jewish community of Amsterdam was, by the standards of 17th century Europe, relatively free, able to practice their religion openly, to run their own schools, to govern their own affairs. It was also, like all communities under pressure, watchful about the boundaries of acceptable thought. Spinoza was educated brilliantly in the community's school. He read Hebrew, Latin, Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish. He studied the Talmud and the medieval Jewish philosophers, Maimonides, Gersonides, Crescas. And he began, in his late teens and early 20s, to think thoughts that the community's theology could not contain. What thoughts exactly? The Herem does not say. But from the philosophy he would spend the next 20 years building, we can reconstruct the outlines. He did not believe the Torah was literally dictated by God. He did not believe the Jewish people were specially chosen in any supernatural sense. He did not believe in a God who intervenes in history, answers prayers, rewards the righteous, or resembles in any way the personal deity of the tradition he had been raised in. What he believed, what he would argue for in the ethics, the masterwork he spent the last 20 years of his life constructing, was something stranger and more demanding and, he was convinced, more true. He believed that God and nature were the same thing. Not that nature points toward God, not that God works through nature, that they are identical. One substance, one infinite, self-causing, completely necessary reality, of which everything that exists, including every human mind and every human body and every thought and every emotion and every act of every person who has ever lived, is an expression, a mode, a temporary, particular, entirely determined modification of the one thing that is. After the excommunication, he moved to the outskirts of Amsterdam, then to Rijnsburg, then to Voorburg, then to The Hague, always in modest rented rooms, always grinding lenses to pay his bills, always writing. He turned down a professorship at the University of Heidelberg, one of the most prestigious academic positions in Europe, because accepting it would have required him to moderate his philosophy out of respect for the established religion. He declined. He stayed in his room. He kept grinding the lenses. He kept writing the ethics. He completed it in 1675. He was 43 years old. He did not publish it in his lifetime, not because it was unfinished, but because he had seen what happened to ideas like his when they reached the wrong eyes too soon. He died in 1677 of a lung disease, almost certainly aggravated by years of inhaling glass dust in the lens-grinding workshop. He was 44 years old. His friends published the ethics within months of his death. The book was immediately banned. It has been in continuous circulation ever since.
The Ethics is written in a form that Spinoza borrowed from Euclidean geometry. Definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, corollaries. It reads, at first encounter, like a mathematics textbook about the nature of God, the structure of the human mind, the mechanics of the emotions, and the path to freedom. It is also, for all its geometric armor, the most personally urgent book in the history of Western philosophy. Because Spinoza is not building a system for its own sake. He is solving a problem. The problem he describes in the opening pages. The problem of a man who has looked at everything the world offers and found, in all of it, no lasting satisfaction. Who has watched people pursue wealth and reputation and pleasure with everything they have, and arrive at the end of the pursuit still wanting, still suffering, still somehow not free. His diagnosis is precise. The suffering, all of it, every form of human misery, comes from the same source. He calls it bondage, the bondage of the passions, the state of a person who is moved, pushed, pulled, tossed, elated, and devastated by things outside themselves, who loves something that can be taken, who fears something that can arrive, who needs the world to go a particular way in order to be at peace, and who therefore is never fully at peace, because the world does not reliably go any particular way. The remedy, the path from bondage to freedom, is not suppression, not willpower, not the grinding determination to feel differently than you feel. It is understanding. Specifically, a particular kind of understanding that Spinoza called adequate ideas, the clear, complete, causally grounded perception of why things are exactly as they are and could not, given the nature of reality, be otherwise. When you understand why something happened, not the surface story, not the narrative of blame and grievance and what should have been different, but the deep, structural, fully causal account of why this particular outcome was the only outcome that the complete chain of causes could have produced, the emotion that was attached to the inadequate understanding does not have to be suppressed. It transforms on its own, because it was made of the misunderstanding. And when the misunderstanding is replaced by clarity, the emotion that depended on it no longer has anything to stand on. This is Spinoza's central claim, and it is the most demanding and the most liberating idea in the history of philosophy. Now, the bridge. Because Spinoza was a 17th-century rationalist philosopher writing in geometric Latin prose about the metaphysical structure of a God who is identical with nature, and most of the people watching this video are not, primarily, students of 17th-century European metaphysics. But here is what translates across 350 years without any adjustment at all. The person who is suffering at 3 in the morning about something that cannot be changed is suffering not because the thing exists, but because they are relating to it with what Spinoza would call an inadequate idea, a partial understanding, a story about what happened that includes the outcome, but not the full causal chain that made the outcome inevitable. The marriage ended. The inadequate idea, it should not have. If this person had been different, if I had done this other thing, if circumstances had been otherwise, it would have gone differently. The suffering comes from the gap between what happened and what the inadequate understanding insists should have happened.
The adequate idea, Spinoza's idea, is harder and stranger and ultimately more freeing. Every person in that marriage was what they were because of the complete, specific, fully causal chain of everything that had made them who they were before they met. Every decision made inside it was the decision that those two people, with those histories, in those circumstances, could make. The ending was not a deviation from what should have happened. It was what happened. Fully caused, fully determined, fully real. And the suffering that comes from insisting it should have been otherwise is the suffering of fighting the nature of reality with the tools of a story. Spinoza is not asking you to become passive,
not to stop trying to change what can be changed. He is asking you to become clear, genuinely, causally, deeply clear about the difference between the things that understanding can transform and the things that resistance can only prolong. Here is what Baruch Spinoza asks of you practically, today. First, find the thing you are resisting and ask why it is exactly as it is. Not the surface story, not the narrative of fault and grievance and what should have been different. The causal story, the deep account of why this situation, this relationship, this health reality, this organizational dysfunction, this aspect of your own character that you have been at war with for 20 years, is the way it is. What made the people in it who they are? What circumstances produced what pressures? What chain of causes, running back further than the moment of crisis, made this particular outcome not merely likely, but, Spinoza would say, necessary? Not to excuse, not to abandon accountability, to understand. Because the suffering that comes from resisting the necessary is not noble, it is not honorable. It is, in Spinoza's precise and compassionate framing, simply a form of confusion. And confusion, unlike suffering, can be cured. Second, locate the emotion and trace it to its idea. Spinoza's most practical contribution to daily life is his mapping of the emotions. He cataloged them: joy, sadness, love, hatred, hope, fear, envy, pride, as experiences to be managed, but as ideas to be understood. Every emotion, he said, is a perception of a change in one's state, and attached to that perception is always an idea, a story, a belief about what caused the change and whether it was good or bad, and whether it could have been otherwise. When the emotion that is causing suffering arrives, the anger, the grief, the specific, familiar, thoroughly unwelcome anxiety that arrives on schedule, ask what idea it is carrying, not what triggered it, what belief it contains, what understanding of the world has to be true for this emotion to make sense. And then ask whether that understanding is adequate, whether it is the full picture, whether the story attached to the feeling is the only story the facts support. Most of the time, it is not, and seeing that clearly, without self-reproach, is already the beginning of the transformation Spinoza spent his life pointing at.
Third, practice what Spinoza called the intellectual love of what is. This is his most difficult and most beautiful idea. Not acceptance in the gritted teeth sense, the grudging, white-knuckled, I know I should accept this but I don't, performance of equanimity. The genuine, understanding-based, completely non-sentimental recognition that everything that exists necessarily, that the universe, seen clearly enough, could not be other than it is, and that this recognition, held steadily enough, produces something that Spinoza called beatitudo, blessedness. Not happiness, not the satisfaction of desires, the specific, quiet, completely sourceless sense of rightness that arrives when the resistance to what is finally exhausts itself, and what remains is simply the thing itself, seen clearly, without the story of how it should have been different. Once today, in one moment with one thing you have been resisting, try to see it this way, not through the story of wrongness, through the clear, causal, fully adequate account of why it is exactly as it is.
And notice what happens to the resistance when the seeing goes all the way through. Fourth, grind the lenses. This is the practice that Spinoza demonstrated more than he described. The daily, unglamorous, physically present work that keeps the mind tethered to the world, not floating in abstraction, not lost in the pure ether of ideas, but present, handling things, shaped by the resistance of actual material against actual hands. He ground lenses for 20 years, not as a metaphor, as a livelihood, and many of his biographers believe as a philosophical practice. The lens is, after all, the instrument of clarity, the tool by which the blurred becomes sharp, the distant becomes visible. The thing that was always there but too small or too far to see is brought, through patient shaping and precise calibration, into focus. Find your lens grinding, the work that requires your full attention and returns you, when you are done, to yourself. The practice that the philosophizing cannot substitute for. The cooking, the woodworking, the running, the instrument, the garden. The thing made by hands that keeps the mind honest about what is real. That is the practice, not the suppression of what you feel, the understanding of it, deep enough, clear enough, causally grounded enough that the feeling changes not because you forced it to, but because the idea it was built on no longer holds. I want to close with the image that I keep returning to when I think about Spinoza. Not the excommunication, not the geometric prose, not the God who is identical with nature.
The room, the small, rented, entirely voluntary room in The Hague, where the most radical philosopher in Europe spent his afternoons bent over a lens-grinding wheel, breathing glass dust, shaping glass for other people's telescopes, knowing that the book he was writing would not be published in his lifetime, knowing that the ideas in it would be banned the moment they appeared, knowing all of this and grinding the lenses anyway, writing the ethics anyway, turning down the professorship anyway. Not because he was indifferent to comfort or recognition, because he had done for himself what he was describing in the book, had understood clearly enough and deeply enough why the world was as it was, why the community had done what it had done, why the institutions would ban what they would ban, that the resistance had gone out of him. Not passivity, not defeat, the specific, hard-won, lens-ground clarity of a person who sees the necessity in things and is therefore no longer at war with them. He called it human freedom, the highest thing available to a human being. Not the freedom of getting what you want, not the freedom of controlling your circumstances, the freedom of understanding your circumstances so completely that the suffering which came from misunderstanding them simply, and this is the word he used, ceases. Here is the question Baruch Spinoza leaves us with today. Not from the synagogue that cast him out, not from the rented rooms or the lens-grinding wheel or the geometric pages of the ethics. From the gap, the specific, familiar, 3 a.m. gap between knowing you cannot change something and being free of the suffering that comes from wishing you could. What is the thing you understand but have not yet seen clearly enough? What is the story you are still telling about what should have been different, about who is to blame, about the outcome that should not have happened, that is keeping you in bondage to a version of reality that the reality itself has already moved past? Not to forgive, not to accept prematurely, to understand,
to follow the causes back far enough that the story of wrongness gives way to the clear, quiet, adequate seeing of what is. Leave that in the comments, the thing you are still resisting, and what it might feel like to finally understand it all the way through. Because that question, sitting with it honestly, is already the beginning of the freedom Spinoza spent his life grinding lenses to see. I'll see you in the next one.